Great. Good evening, everybody. Let me welcome you all. My name is Pedro Schilling. I'm assistant professor in financial and environmental law, and today I'm also wearing my hat as co-director of the Center for Law and Environmental, Center for Law and Environments, alongside my brilliant co-director, Professor Eloise Scotford, also the dean of the law school. Thank you very much on behalf of the center for being here today. This is the second time we're running these formats, trying to do a sort of a quick response event to what has happened at the COP, but trying to go a little bit further from that as well. We've tried once again to have a panel that brings very different perspectives to our discussion. We're trying to mix views from academia, from private practice, from the government, from NGOs, and so on and so forth. To try to find some common grounds and to try to find nice ways to move forwards. We do have a lovely panel that I'll quickly introduce, but you can always Google for more on their very accomplished careers. I'll start with our dear Veselina Haralapieva, who is the head of Sustainable Finance Governance and Regulation at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And more importantly, today, sitting for the first time as our new honorary professor of practice here at UCL. We're really thrilled to have you here, and we're really looking forward to the many, hopefully great things we're going to be doing together. I have to my right, Professor Carlos Portugal Gouveia, who's a professor of corporate law at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and a visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. And again, maybe more importantly, and one of those sweet things from academia, my supervisor more than 10 years ago back in Brazil. Always happy to meet the same folks in different settings. So thank you very much for coming to London today. We have our own Monse Madariaga Gomez de Cuenca, who again has many different hats, sitting here today as lawyer at Legal Response International, one of the main NGOs that provides support for low-income countries in climate negotiations, advisor to the Chilean government and to other governments as well, and PhD candidate, although I might say soon to be doctor, with a viva next week here at the UCL Faculty of Laws. And last but not least, we do have Lucia Williams, Senior Associate at Clyde & Co. Climate Risk and Resilience Practice. And one of the very nice coincidences is we met last year at this very same event, had a great conversation afterwards, and today we're benefiting from her expertise today. So I'll say a little bit about how things are going to work, how we're going to try to facilitate today's discussion. I'll start with a brief scene setting on the main decisions of COP29. We have a very nice, diverse audience here today with students, practitioners, folks from governments and beyond. So it's just an attempt to get everybody on the same page on the main decisions that are relevant for the stuff that we're discussing. Then we're going to have 2 rounds of questions. We're going to start discussions focusing on the international level of the discussions that we're taking at the COP, thinking about some of the implications of that. We are going to tackle the T word in the room, the upcoming Trump presidency and what that means for multilateral collaboration at the international level. And then on the second round, we're going to come down to discussions at the domestic level. After all, without implementation, without advancements at the country level, we're not really going to achieve the impact that we want to achieve. If it all goes well and the gods of technology help us today, we're going to have some closing remarks from Dr. Carolina Grotera, who's a program director at the Brazilian Ministry of Finance. You might know, but COP30, the Big 30, is going to happen in Brazil, in Belém. So hopefully we'll benefit from some insights and some scoops on what's to come at COP30 as well. Lovely. So I've been already rambling for a bit, but I'll start with a brief summary of the key COP29 decisions. COP29 happens a few weeks ago in Baku, was dubbed by many the climate finance COP, especially because one of the big topics in discussion was the negotiation of the new collective quantified goal of climate finance. In broad terms, this is sort of the floor in terms of investments from developed country parties, what we're sort of expecting that high-income countries, generally speaking, will bring to the table in terms of development assistance and climate finance more broadly. We had a current sort of targets of 100 billion per year, which according to which organization you're looking was achieved or wasn't achieved a couple of years back. And importantly, that sort of that floor, that investment floor grounds the obligations under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. So there was a number of objectives in the new collective quantified goal of climate finance, trying to be more ambitious, trying to increase from that 100 billion per year number, and especially trying to ground it more with a reality. The 100 billion was a bit of a nice round number, but that didn't really reflect the climate needs that we have. Over the last few years, we have growing consensus, even amongst organizations at the international level, like the IMF, like the World Bank, that the needs are upwards of $1.3, $1.5 trillion per year. So a far cry from the 100 billion that we had before. So the mandate and the expectations for Baku were pretty high. What we ended up with, and that we're going to try to debrief, whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, or something in between, was a decision that calls on all actors to work together to facilitate the scaling up of finance for developing countries from all public and private sources to reach at least 1.3 trillion per year by 2035. We know that goal entails developed countries taking the leads with a contribution of at least 300 billion per year until 2035 for developing country parties. We know that those funds are going to come from a variety of sources, both public and private, bilateral and multilateral. The decision also mentions some other more lateral things, such as the need to reduce cost of capital, especially for low and middle income countries, and the need to increase mobilization of public finance sources, especially in a moment where official development assistance has been going down in broad terms across the planets. And then aside from that decision on the quantum, on trying to establish that new floor, other topics that were part of the negotiations, including definitions, sources of that funding, regional floors, accountability mechanisms, and so on, didn't really come to a conclusion. We didn't have a consensus on how to take those things forwards, which led to the launch of the Baku to Belém roadmap for the 1.3 trillion, which further justifies we're trying to bring in the Brazilian counterparties that now have already a pretty big agenda to try to deliver on for COP30. Aside from finance, a few developments of note in other parts of the decisions. On the multilateral development bank space, they're not formally a part of the COPs, but increasingly, I think multilateral development banks have been going to COPs, and vice versa. Increasingly, the annual meetings of some of the big international financial institutions have been places where climate negotiations have been taking place, or at least climate finance negotiations have been taking place. They released a joint statement, which came with a few supporting documents that are interesting developments. So they released a common approach to measuring climate results and trying to improve indicators for climate finance that's flowing through those multilateral development banks. They released a statement on support of country-led platforms, trying to empower countries to find their preferred ways to attain mitigation and adaptation-related goals. and have sort of reinforced that they are trying to ramp up assistance in helping countries to develop long-term strategies, nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, as well as other climate, biodiversity, and just transition plans as well. Aside from finance, aside from what the multilateral development banks have done, some discussions related to adaptation. The COP had a mandate to discuss national adaptation plans. We ended up with no decision on that space, but rather only with a series of principles for adaptation indicators was established, and an expert group was convened to conduct a review and refinements of the mapping of indicators to measure progress on the adaptation space. Last but not least, and again, only the big picture, there's countless other small developments that we could focus on as well today. We had decisions on the adoption of international standards in relation to the global carbon markets. That's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and that sort of includes requirements for the approval of methodologies and activities for the removal of GHGs in that broad markets. Hopefully that gives you a good glimpse of some of the issues that were in contention, some of how far we went in relation to finding consensus in some of those topics, and what is left to COP30 now that already has a pretty big agenda and has sort of the shadow of the US withdrawing from the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreements once again. So with that, I can finally move to hear from much more established experts and much more interesting insights, starting at the international level or landscape. And I'd like to start with our own Montse, who is now a very, very seasoned climate negotiator, to share some of your impressions on the outcomes of COP29, and especially in view of your producing a policy brief here for UCL on reforming COP processes. So it'd be great to hear your impressions on the outcomes of COP29, and especially as the US leaves the Paris Agreement again, what can or should we expect from the multilateral regime?
Thank you. Nothing, I think, no. Sorry, an icebreaker.
And the event is done.
Stupid icebreaker, I'm sorry. No, thank you, Pedro, also for outlining the outcomes for everyone who might have not been following the process so closely. I think that the outcomes on finance and on most topics, especially this year, were extremely disappointing. And it's not just civil society or some countries saying it, but for example, in the closing plenary of COP29, in the early hours of Sunday, India would give an intervention that has made the headlines. We are disappointed in the outcome, which clearly brings out the unwillingness of the developed country parties to fulfill their responsibilities. We cannot accept it. This is in reference to the new collective quantified goal. But India also made another point. There was rumor that India was ready to block the decision, the finance decision on the plenary. And only after the president called the decision on finance as agreed, India was given the floor. The Indian representative said they discussed with the Secretariat and the presidency their aim on intervening and object before agreeing on the goal. And then she said, this has been an unfortunate incident, and it is in continuation of a string of such unfortunate incidents that we have seen on not following inclusivity. Then, when Nigeria followed this intervention, they would say, we have a right to decide as countries if we're going to take this or not. Also referencing that among these two countries, they sum up close to 1/4 of the world population. The outcomes reflect, of course, political will or petty geopolitics, as some have labeled. In that sense, the election of the US President Trump and a potential withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement is said to have had an impact in the outcome of this COP. It is said that other developed countries held back on their efforts because they thought then the US wouldn't deliver on their share. But these outcomes are also a reflection on the process leading to them. And this is the point that Tejas, Rao, and myself are trying to bring up in our upcoming policy brief about reforming the COP process. This year in particular, I think for the first time, we're hearing loads on the process. For example, on the same process leading to the finance goal, the presidency of COP29 president has come in The Guardian with a column giving an opinion where they say that they lament how small the goal agreed is. And they explicitly name and shame some countries, saying that my negotiating team and I did not table this 250 billion proposal, which was the initial proposal, because we thought it sufficient to arrest the climate crisis. Nor did we wish to hold back its announcement to the final days of the summit, leaving so little time to change it. Rather, we put it forward because the global north had been simply immovable in our efforts to either increase this figure or announce it earlier. Effectively, the first time we heard about a quantum this time was 2 days before the closing of COP. Developed countries did not agree on a draft containing a figure until then. And that puts the question, from my perspective, if these countries are actually negotiating in good faith or not, because negotiating in good faith means approaching the negotiation with an intention to reach a conclusion or an agreement. And when you sort of hold your cards close to your chest for so long, that's questionable. So perhaps when we hear about COPs, process might not seem as sexy as the outcomes. But my pitch, Tejas and I, who've been working in the negotiations for some time and spending weeks, and maybe because we are lawyers, we have picked up on the importance of these elements. So in our research, we unveiled certain key findings of the process that undermine the opportunities that developing countries have to engage in meaningful negotiation, but that also undermine potentially the ambition of the outcomes. So we only have the outcomes that we have because of the process that we have as well, or it has an influence. As I said, political will is very important, politics is very important, but process has a say. For example, among the key findings that we unveil are the stark difference between delegations among developing and developed countries. Developing countries, they find severe constraints to bring delegates. Some of them maintain 5 to 10 delegates, while developed nations can bring 200 or 300 easily. And this numerical disadvantage is compounded by limited access to legal expertise. Only 40% of developing countries have legal experts in their ranks. And legal issues are more and more being used in the negotiations. The issue of mandate, of bodies, of how to present a point of order, or these sort of things are coming up more and more. And therefore, this puts them in a disadvantage. There's been strategic obstructions on the negotiations. There are other ethnographers of COP that already have picked up on how, for example, some countries intentionally delay the negotiations with an intention for them to daily overrun. So negotiators are more tired by the end of the negotiation, knowing that developing countries have fewer negotiators, that they stay more far away from the venue because accommodation is very expensive for the 2 weeks of COP. And so that makes them more tired. And also, at the end of COP, there's the tendency to overrun negotiations more than a day even, as it was now. And these developing country negotiators, or some of them, many times they can't stay until the end because they only have tickets for an accommodation, visas, and a mandate to go back to their countries. And so that many times they can't see the end of the negotiation. And that, of course, means their voices are not heard. The COP has not been able to approve their own rules of procedure, and that means that everything is approved by consensus, and that represents a burden because, of course, reaching consensus is very difficult, and that amplifies the power or the geopolitical power of some actors in reference to others, because everyone needs to be on board, or at least all the groups. And it also diminishes the ambition. So a key finding is also, or a key reform would be to approve these rules of procedure urgently, especially the voting rules. So not everything has to be decided on consensus. And well, there are many other procedural aspects to explore in the negotiations, but my take is that, especially in this COP, we have seen mainstreaming how important the process was, and the flaws in the process, and the lack of transparency in the process was for the outcome and the disappointing outcome that we achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monse. And as probably a note to even put more into context, that the COP presence usually has a very large leeway to decide how it's taking forward the negotiations, and we saw a especially sort of more centralized process probably this year compared to other COPs. So with that, we might go to the opposite end of the table today and hear a little bit from Vessi. I think it's fair to say that increasingly in the last few COPs, the development banks have been both more present and have been asked to do increasingly more, despite pressure from the donor sides in putting the money there. And we do have still palpable challenges in terms of achieving finance and scale, and especially getting the mix between public and private sources right, especially when it comes to middle-income countries, low-income countries. Being in a very privileged position to deal with those issues, could you share a bit of which areas have progressed and have which challenges we have been able to tackle a little bit more, and what are some of the key issues that are still finding big barriers?
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro, and hello, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and especially really delighted to see so many people, young people here, which I think it's really all these COP, 30 of them. I mean, 30 with the one that is coming in Brazil. It's really for all of us, but mainly for the young people. So I'm very encouraged to see the interest that this generates. So before I turn to your point, Pedro, I just wanted to comment on what Montserrat said about this consensus at the COP. I think it's really important to I second everything that you said, but I just wanted to say that that's a very complex. So it's my 7th or 8th COP, and it's usually a place where everything for us, or representatives from multilateral development banks, happens outside the negotiation rooms. It's just so much going on in the corridors, in the meetings, in the events that we or our partners or our countries' operations organize. So that's actually what it's in at the COPs for us. But every time it hits me, the feeling that that's a very, very complex process, right? It's nearly 200 countries. Decisions have to be taken, as you said, by consensus. What consensus means, I mean, you probably know better, but to me it's unclear, because consensus definitely is not anonymity, right? So the decisions are taken. India, Nigeria went out, so they left the room, so it's definitely not anonymity, but we don't want anonymity, right? We just want a robust and meaningful representation. But that means that decisions, when they are reached, which of course a decision that we see in the news at the end of November, this rests on years of work by different working groups. And it takes us an inch forward. It's an incremental advancement. Yes, we need giant leaps because climate change is here. Unfortunately, the impact of climate change really is most kind of acutely felt in developing countries, in those that actually rely on the coffers of the developed world for making the necessary kind of building the resilience to climate change. So that's why we start talking about climate finance. Yes, this is the finance COP. It is probably the second most important COP for multilateral development banks. Some would say the first, but why is the second for me is because the first one was 2 years after the Paris Agreement in 2017, when the most kind of, I think 8 or 9 of the largest MDBs, the World Bank Group, IFC, ourselves at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Asian, the African, the Islamic development banks, they reached a decision to align all their financing with the Paris Agreement. So that was, colossal at that time. That was massive. So we were the only one that we committed to align all of our financing with Paris by 2023. So each of our projects in the public and private sector for 2 years now is aligned with Paris. And I'll talk more about that another. But what it means is that now, just to give you, also the perspective that for the World Bank and IFC, which of course, the big elephants in the room, for them has been always gradual. So that's 50–75% of alignment towards working full alignment with Paris. So in terms of financing, so you actually did a very, very good overview of what the MDBs have achieved in the joint declaration. We always do joint declaration, but I think this one was really important. And you mentioned that the new collective quantified goal that was agreed is 300 billion annually. Absolutely insufficient, right? So I think we are clear. We're talking that, as you mentioned, the needs estimated various estimates, but we're talking that these billions have to be turned into trillions. So how do we do it? There are no public funds that can do that. Clearly, I think, and that has been, that's what has been MDBs have been working on, especially where I work, is mobilizing finance from the private sector. So in order for us to be able to have this systemic transformation change in the regions where we operate, we cannot do it based on public funds alone. But what we kind of committed to out of this 300 billion, and that's why, as you said, the role of MDBs is becoming kind of more and more visible. It's always been there as non-state actors, but out of this 300 billion, we as a group have committed, have put out a collective goal of 120 billion investment to low and medium and middle income countries, and additional 60 billion for developed countries. So this is mainly the EIB, the European Investment Bank, where they operate in Europe. So where is this a lot? Is this a little? I think, as I mentioned, it's not sufficient in absolute terms in order to meet the needs of the developing world. But we as a development, as development banks, we do not provide only funding, because the reality is that in many instances, and that was been the case for the last few years, there is funding available. There are no projects that are viable, green projects that are viable and that could, absorb climate finance. And of course, another big area of our work is to mobilize, as I mentioned, private sector financing. So to invest in enabling environments, bring in new technologies, provide technical assistance, work on a policy reform, in order to provide also sufficient guarantees for the private sector to invest. So that's what, we want economies that are viable, that do not rely on grants or on concessional funding. So what also I thought important for us is increasingly the MDBs, increasingly under pressure, but increasingly we are asked to innovate in terms of not only the funding that we make available, but how do we make it available? How do we achieve this transformational change? And another big reform in the MDBs, which has been going for quite a while, I think you touched upon it, is measuring impact. So, okay, we have been as a group measuring the climate finance investment for 7-8 years. So that's a collective report available annually. Last year, it was 65 billion. So it gives you, also a reference point. So we are scaling up to 120 billion. So in terms of this investment, a lot what we heard here from our also country's operations is these numbers do not mean much because we also want to see the impact. How do you measure impact? And frankly speaking, that's very difficult. Because one thing is, I don't know how many of you are interested or will be working in corporate finance, but one thing is to look at individual projects and how the MDBs are set to operate and supporting a project, raising funds to invest in new infrastructure. The other thing is to measure impact, especially if you work on smaller corporate deals. And so that's something that's a reform that is ongoing in the World Bank. We're also working on that and measuring impact and aligning it with kind of amongst the MDBs, but also with the country priorities. So I want only to mention 2-3 things, but just kind of to list them. For us, in terms of new products, what has been very important is engaging with national authorities, with donors, with the private sector to build what we call it country-based platforms. So these are big, huge infrastructure projects where, for example, I can give you an example. Last year for us, we have signed a just transition renewable energy platforms with North Macedonia. So So the idea is that in this type of program, we bring in expertise, we bring in donors, we bring other investors, but we also work with the country to set up ambitious nationally determined contributions and sector policies that will attract more private sector funds. And the final thing, which is very important for the upcoming COP, and which is now also an interesting area for any of you that are finishing law school and want to work in this area, is nature finance. How do you that's even more challenging because that's new. How do you work together to alleviate the global planetary crisis? So not only looking at climate, but also looking at nature finance, looking at generally remedying environmental degradation. I'll wrap up with that.
Thank you very much, Vessi. And hopefully you can see why we brought Vessi in, because each of those many different interesting things that have been happening is enough for different events. And hopefully with her appointment, we will have those events in the future as well. I want to try to connect what Vessi mentioned to come to you, Carlos. If you're not busy enough as an academic, I know you also have a think tank which has been dealing with similar issues related to implementation of some of those policies at the national level, and especially focusing on dealing with certain groups of stakeholders back in Brazil. So I think Vessi's point about which green projects, finding green projects that are viable is something that you have been trying to find out in practice and on the ground as well. So could you share a bit about your experience, and especially when it comes again to challenges in impacting the stakeholders in the right way, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Pedro. As you can imagine, it's a tremendous happiness actually for me to be here. It's like a movie of my life in the table. So I had the chance to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts with Vessi many years ago when we were still very young. And maybe we dreamed that someday we would be doing the work that we are actually doing now. So it's a very happy opportunity to be here. But I have to say that I'm back in Cambridge. And one thing that is, on the one hand, it's good, is the weather. It improved very much. It used to be really cold. But if we look at the reason why it improved, it's not that good. And a lot of people in the city say that climate change is Boston's friend. And it actually is. Like, they haven't had a winter storm in the last 5 years. So there's no snow on the streets anymore. They don't know what snow is. And you remember that, the winter storms were really bad, horrible, and they don't exist anymore. People don't need to take snow out of their sidewalks anymore. But I'm also happy with the opportunity to be here with Pedro. So I went back to Brazil to teach because I thought some of the problems that Montserrat mentioned, I thought they were actually true, the lack of capacity in developing countries. I wanted to do something about Brazil. So it's a real joy to see Pedro, who was probably my brightest student.
He says that to everybody.
In his first recommendation letter, and I still stand by it. So it's great to see how your career developed as well. It was my dream, to help my students to become, thought leaders around the world. So you were a proof that, at least this dream of mine, this at least became a reality. And I wanted to react a little bit to what Montserrat mentioned, that of course we can look at what happened in COP29 and look at what we lost, the battles that we lost. But looking at in a larger perspective, and especially coming from Brazil, and you have to remember that, well, let's say this discussion basically started with Rio 92. If we look at this discussion, how it was proposed in 92, a lot of people thought that, even talking about carbon credits then was ridiculous. People thought it was ridiculous, that it would never exist. Carbon credit markets would never exist. And now they exist and they are a reality. And it always has been a struggle. I'm coming here after finishing teaching ESG in the United States. So, the feeling towards the end of my course could have been like a rest in peace ESG kind of approach. But the way that I thought since the beginning was showing that, ESG didn't start 3 years ago. Of course, it started being discussed many years ago under different names. It has been a struggle of like more than a century related to what I understand as like the corporate ethics. And it has been movements toward a development of that thinking, and there have been pushbacks in the past as well. Especially in the US, we might be in a moment of like a pushback. In other countries, we are moving forward, and it has always been like that. It has always been a struggle. And what made me believe in that was when I realized another dream that was actually to the reason why we set up this think tank about just energy transition in Brazil. It's called Institute for Global Law. And when we created it, it was a response to something that became very clear, that we needed to put the people who are most affected by climate change in positions in which they could actually speak, and legitimate people could actually speak. And in the case of Brazil, I think the groups that represent that are indigenous communities. Because you might know the indigenous communities in Brazil, for example, if you look at the Amazon, which is actually probably the major engine of carbon control in the world, the greatest potential for issuance of carbon credits are in indigenous communities in the Amazon. And you might have followed that, a series of carbon credit issuance, especially on voluntary markets in the past, led to fraudulent issuances. And we have a research project that is actually plotting, the issuances and the areas in which you have indigenous communities to demonstrate that actually many of these issuances actually were using indigenous lands. So our purpose was exactly like to train indigenous people to participate in those international events, like to send them to participate to the COPs. And we did that in Doha, and we did that in Baku. And what our experience has been is that it's actually a struggle as any other experience in the world. It's not that there is no one else in the other side. In the other side, there are very political, strong political powers and economic powers that need to be fought. And, you need to gather support for that. And it happens internationally and it happens domestically as well. And sometimes you have an interesting interplay between that. And I would like to give a very concrete example of that. There was the announcements resulting from Baku. I think they made a positive impact in Brazil. So in our institute, we have been following the long discussion about creating a regulated market for carbon credits in Brazil. So in a sense, it's kind of like a shame that the Rio conference happened in '92 in Brazil, and up until now, we don't have a regulated market for carbon credits in Brazil. But we don't have it for a reason. Many of the industries that oppose it are actually very strong in Brazil. So the cattle industry, the mining industry, they're very strong. And sometimes even like a state-owned company, Petrobras, the largest state-owned company in Brazil is like an oil company, and it's hard to sometimes even to deal with like the employees of those companies, and like to trade unions, which in the past were automatically aligned to progressive causes such as protecting the environment. But sometimes you have to explain to them how they're not going to lose their jobs if you actually move the company into an energy transition process. And at this point, we saw that in the discussion for this new law in Congress at certain points was at the risk of becoming completely useless, like having a law in place that would be completely useless. And what were the kind of like criticisms that we presented? If it's not an actual regulated market, because at certain point people thought, well, you have a hybrid, like a voluntary market with certain, governmental, oversight, but no cap and trade system. So nobody would have actually to pay for anything. You would not put, a price tag on the pollution that was emitted. Another problem was that they wanted the system not to have an additionality component. So then eventually you would have projects that would lead to problems that, in the regulated markets, for example, in Europe, you dealt with a long time ago. That was the problem of like hot air or like fake issuance of carbon credits. And another major criticism that we had to the law was that the agricultural sector was not included, especially the cattle industry, which are the largest emitters of carbon in Brazil nowadays. And if we look at the law that was actually approved by Congress 2 weeks ago, it's the Bill 182 from 2024. If you look at those three issues, we won, let's say, on two of them. So we would have a cap and trade system if it's signed into law by the president, and we would have additionality, but we lost the agricultural sector. But if you look at it on balance, it was very positive. And in my view, it was a direct response to the resolutions on COP29, because, in a sense, we are going to have a COP in Brazil, in Belém, and it would be kind of like shameful for us not to have done anything domestically in response to what is provided internationally. And of course, there was a pressure from the government, but we also had a pressure from the private sector. So the Ministry of Finance in particular was able actually to amass approval from the private sector, from the capital market sector in particular, to say, well, that's a financial opportunity for the country as well. And, the sum of all those efforts actually made the law be approved in Congress. As Pedro knows, that's considering what our Congress, like how it's populated, it's a tremendous victory. So, there is a bit of good that comes out of it.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think it already highlights that the process, even though not sexy, is often quite relevant, and especially if we expand a bit the frame of analysis there. Last but not least, once again, Lucia, I think I really enjoyed following your updates throughout COP, and I think you described yourself as a COP novice on one of them, and you're coming from an interesting place because your main area of practice, insurance law, has been very central for many of the new discussions at the international level. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your insights coming from the private sector, coming from the insurance industry. How was that experience of seeing negotiations at the international level for that first time?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a real honor to be able to share a bit of my experiences. And if I had to give it a title, it would probably be A Tale of Two COPs. Because on the one hand, there's the COP of the negotiations, which Monse so expertly illustrated for us. And on the other hand, there's the whole plethora of events and side events and panels that goes on around it. So kind of, I've heard it talked about as a trade fair, but with a running Guardian commentary. And the private sector was there in force this year, as it has been before. I was there with the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, as part of the bingo group, not the game, even though a UCL professor apparently has a COP acronyms bingo, which looks fun, but it was the business and industry and geo group. So they're presenting the side of the business sector. And as Carlos suggested, it has been recognized how important it is to actually get those sectors. Like one of the sectors there was the agricultural sector, and how important it is to have them included as well. And another sense was both from the kind of the international organization and the government side, recognizing the value that business can add in terms of, well, obviously finance, first and foremost, and obviously the part that private finance has to play was recognized in the decisions and a lot of the documents coming out of COP, but also on the business perspective, how important it is to be present at this table and be, not to borrow a phrase from Anthony Hobley, who's deputy chair of Howden Brokers, to be not just in the room but at the table. And that was the sense that he had about insurance's role at this particular COP. And the ways in which insurance can enable the transition to net zero were discussed. I was at a round table there where Anthony and Howden, together with the Boston Consulting Group and the High Level Climate Champions, presented a report called Insurance, the Great Enabler, which it draws on a concept that actually Francisca Arnold-Waller, professor here, talks about in her book Insurance, Climate Change and the Law, which I would recommend. And it's about how insurance really has a threefold role that it can play in enabling climate change transition, really supporting that process of speeding up, like Leslie was mentioning, how kind of COP work is built on years and years of negotiations. There's an idea that the private sector can maybe do things quicker once, or do things, speed things up once they sort of set their minds to it, and recognize the benefits as well. So in terms of the sort of three main areas for insurance, well, the first one is capital flows, and capital flows towards climate action. And not just from the standpoint of insurers as investors themselves, because obviously insurers have around 35 trillion assets, of which 1.2 trillion or 2 trillion were actually managed by professional investors. So obviously that's a sizable amount of finance that can be directed, but also in what they can do to de-risk capital allocation to technologies that are seen as inherently more risky. So kind of first of a kind folk type technologies, like, for instance, a difficult plastics recycling facility in the US, which was made, the plastics that are difficult to recycle, was made possible by the fact that there was insurance in place for it. And secondly, managing operational risk in climate projects. And here we've seen a role of parametric insurance coming in. So parametric insurance being the type of insurance that it's triggered by certain parameters coming into being, like excessive heat or storm surges, so that these policies would pay out when those consequences come about before the damage is actually takes place. The idea being that if the policyholder has the payout, then they can act to prevent that damage and prevent the whole host of consequences that arises from kind of poorly managed disasters. And we've seen those kind of policies applied for the benefit of new technologies, including like technologies like wind, where the sort of supply of wind isn't as assured as possibly other energy sources, or even in kind of more local domestic contexts to, say, smallholder farmers, or a great project I've heard about in India, ensuring women garment workers against the effect of excessive heat, so that they get a payout when it's too hot for them to work effectively, and they don't need to lose their jobs with all of the consequences that go with that. And then the third area, which is a very interesting one, and which was mentioned before, is nature-based solutions as well, and how insurance can help really scale those up. And we've got examples such as mangrove restoration on the Indus River Delta, and we've got examples of the Mesoamerican coral reef off the coast of Mexico, Quintana Roo, which was insured with a parametric policy, so that once it looked like a storm was coming, the people responsible immediately would get a payout, so they could go quickly out and sort of repair the reef as much as they could, so that it would be ready to withstand oncoming storms. And this also, the idea that there are these capabilities addresses the point as well about the fact of there being funding but not enough projects, and the idea being that by removing that risk, it can also give confidence to people to actually start implementing those projects and those new technologies that are out there, especially small and medium enterprises, which were a big participant at COP this year, and are a real sort of focal point of the real economy. And a lot of new technologies start out with these small companies that then, scale up or get bought out. So yeah, obviously the challenges are real, both at a kind of negotiation side and at the level of insufficient ambition and still excessive funds and going towards fossil fuels and so on. But so there is awareness of that. But the fact that there are some positive examples coming up would hopefully act as a sort of catalyzer for further action.
Great. It's interesting how I think participation has been popping up in different answers. And I think especially to your points, we saw a broadening of participation for some groups that were not necessarily present at the COPs. I think especially the finance folks, which is in contrast to remaining gaps, I think, especially for low and middle income countries, at least in a good number of different discussions. Lovely. So with that, we covered a bit of the international level. We're going to try to shift our focus a bit to the domestic level. I'll mention right at the start as well, the great thing about having a diverse panel is that we have a diverse panel. The bad thing about it is timekeeping becomes a bit of an issue, so I'll be a bit more authoritarian than I'm usually in my day-to-day life during round two. so that hopefully we can hear from Carolina more or less at the time we thought. And hopefully, if we don't have time for a Q&A here, we do have, or at least I hope we have, a drinks reception waiting for us outside, where you can, grab your favorite speaker and ask all your burning questions to them. So I might go back to Vessi. I think we have a natural sort of segue to coming back to you. And I'll again mention you do have that sort of front row seats to what's happening. I wanted to give you a chance, I think, especially thinking about domestic implementation, for you to give an overview of some of the stuff that the EBRD has been doing. So it launched the Sustainable Transition Facility, which is quite interesting. It has been testing out some sustainable finance products that are, if nothing else, pretty different from what's out there. So maybe you can start us off with.
Thank you, Pedro. Sure. Do only the highlights. Yes, one thing that I think we expressed jointly with Lucia as well is in terms of projects and finance, availability of, developing new projects, but also I think capacity building, awareness raising, bringing in all these new technologies to the markets, developing markets. So how do development banks go about it? And then I would also like to link this piece to what I mentioned at the beginning about Paris alignment. So what is a Paris alignment for an investment institution? How do we know if projects are in Paris aligned? So I'm not going to go through the methodology. It's 100-page for us, and any of the other entities have a similar methodology. But the key conclusions are that now when we have started working on assessing each project, so at each project we assess using various criteria, the criteria that are common, within the whole kind of approach for COP. So mitigation, adaptation, plan of finance, looking at the science-based targets, or looking at carbon lock-in, so all those criteria, carbon, introducing carbon pricing to so economic analysis. So by looking at each of these projects, what we realized is that they are clearly green projects. And that's where I would think that most of the private sector and the kind of the Western, let's say, the investors are looking at, investing, the ones that are that might make commercial sense and that are green, and so those definitely we invest. But as a development bank, we actually have to tackle the thorny issues, the difficult projects, the projects that actually support the developing economies in terms of, just to open brackets here, more than 2/3 of the countries where we operate have been traditionally dependent on fossil fuels, more than 2/3 of the energy production dependent on fossil fuels. But we cannot, and I think that that's a clear message, that we cannot shy away from those projects. What we need to do is we need to work with big state-owned enterprises, with kind of hard-to-abate sectors such as aluminium, steel, cement. Work with them to help them align, through investments, identify and develop new technologies. Work at a national level as well to help create those new technologies that are, best available technology becomes a best available technology for these sectors, but also locally produced. So that these are quite a number of steps. And in order for us to, to continue working, we have set various programs. So we have set, for example, for Turkey now with the COP, we revealed Turkey decarbonization platform. So what that means is, for 2 years, we have been working with the Turkish government to develop a low carbon pathway for 4 of those hard-to-abate sectors. These are very much informed by science-based target, but what they need is investment. They need attracting also new technologies. And so our role as an NGVs, and these are quite new, relatively new products, is then we team up with the government, with the private sector, with the industries. We bring in finance, new technologies, we bring in other donors, and we have committed with the government to adopt this low carbon technology subject to us and others making funding and new technologies available. So I would think that this is one of those, I would say, processes that require quite a lot of legwork, but then would lead to giant leaps over time, because that will also be a demonstration impact will have on the region. So that's one thing. The other thing that you mentioned, which is very much focused on private sector clients, is we realize that also when we work with financial institutions, for example, so we provide funding and then they lend on their borrowers. How can we assess whether their investment is Paris aligned? And we have developed, we at TBRD, I'm proud to say that this was the approach that was adopted by other NDBs. We basically stood back and we said, we want to work not on a project level, not looking, narrowly where our investment goes, but with the entity, with the organization, with this financial institution. So what we have started doing, for 2 years, the first year we were thinking, okay, we want to get them on the pathway to Paris. We started including as a covenant in our legal agreements, I would say the only MDBs, the only multi-level development bank that has a clear covenant for every project we do with financial institutions, that we will work with them to help them align their financial flows with Paris. And then we develop a trajectory for them and their clients. And because these are repeated clients, this is not one-off, we cannot force a change tomorrow, but following a clearly established benchmarks and timelines, as I mentioned, targets and reporting, we are working with our partner financial institutions to help them align to Paris. So that's support that we provide in terms of financing, in terms of capacity building, in terms of also policy, and also working with their sub-borrowers. And I also want to mention here that, of course, this is support we provide not only to financial institutions, but also to corporates, also, a new product that will develop next year is to cities. But how I have seen the change. So 2 years ago, I started the discussion with a major construction company in Turkey. And we said, well, we will invest only if you commit to certain actions, climate governance, certain climate related risks, targets, measures. And usually in these discussions, you keep it more as a climate or sustainability or banking team. But the general counsel came and said, no, this is not what we're going to do. This is not a matter of compliance. We're not going to do. So we invested 6 months to help them, and I'll link to what Carlos mentioned, to help them to raise the awareness of what financial opportunities, what commercial opportunity will there be if they get on this journey with us. If they get not only financing, but they commit to this climate targets. And now, 2 years later, I could only say that this will be one of our pilot and very successful projects. It will have a huge impact not only on the country but also in the region. And 6 months ago, when we were talking about continuing investment in kind of expanding this group, they were the ones that came and said, we will now set up a new framework, inform about what we have done in order to have now clear climate targets to reduce carbon emissions and to start measuring scope 3. So I definitely see it takes time, but I see the change taking place.
Thank you very much, Vessi. And I can building capacity to actually bring the insights from different areas of practice, I think, has been a consistent challenge for different institutions, not only development banks. I think many sectors from the public sector, colleagues from the public sector have, I think, relate similar challenges. So I want to turn back to Carlos, using Vessi's segue to you as well. I think I already explored a bit how COP sort of changed the landscape in Brazil, especially when it comes to something like carbon markets. Maybe giving your perspective as someone that is in a, fair enough, upper middle income country, but still a middle income country. What are some of your key takeaways working on the front trenches in terms of needs and gaps?
Yeah. So I will go back to the indigenous communities because I think they're a good example. And I will talk about 2 areas in which we work on just energy transition, both trying to capacitate indigenous communities to develop carbon projects and also engaging actual sustainable energy projects. So in the carbon credit arena, I think it became clear for those following those news that some of the issuances that were made, especially in voluntary markets, were not made, let's say, correctly. So the money didn't flow to the hands of the people who actually had the capacity to actually protect whatever asset they were supposed to protect. So most of the frauds were a result of the Red Plus system, which, if we look at it historically, was a system that evolved exactly to incorporate the concept of additionality. So you need to actually have a project. So the carbon credits will pay for a project that will actually or reduce substantially the emissions or increase capture of carbon. So the idea would be, for example, in a deforestation project, to actually pay someone to prevent deforestation. What is, as you can imagine, hard to do. In the case of indigenous communities, you could think, well, those are like the best people to do that, because, you know, they are in the region. Sometimes they have title to the land. They have some kind of certification of control for their land, so they can actually work. And if you look at this in the Amazon, it makes total sense, you know, like to have a way to protect the forest is also a way to protect the indigenous communities, because as you might have read in the news, for example, the major threat to the Yanomami community, the most isolated indigenous communities actually in the world, were illegal mining, illegal fishing, illegal logging, and drug dealings, all actions that are actually related to deforestation as well, but also are a threat to their livelihood and survivance. So it would make sense to give money to these people to protect the forest, but also to protect themselves. But what is the problem when the carbon credits are issued fraudulently? This money doesn't flow into the hands of the indigenous people. And it doesn't flow to the hands of the indigenous people because you have like tons of intermediaries that operate in this market. And if you actually come to this kind of area with the mindset that probably I do, or Pedro, like people who study capital markets, you know, that's a problem for every single capital market. You know, it's always a problem, like how much money intermediates get and how much they get paid and those transaction costs. But in this case, it's particularly tragic because actually they don't take just a cut, they take everything. You know, they don't have title to the land, so they cannot actually make any action to protect the land. It was all a fraud since the beginning. And in many ways, in many situations, actually indigenous communities were misled, or these people use like fraudulent documents, fraudulent titles of land. They eventually issued carbon credits based on federal land, indigenous lands that were dedicated to other activities. So, you know, if we look at the top, you can think, well, more money is always good, but it might not be the case. More money, not well spent, might do more worse than good. And a lot of it depends on building capacity. So, for example, what is my dream, my vision is that the indigenous communities with whom we work, they will be able to develop the projects themselves. So I have this knowledge, I have to give them this knowledge, I have to train these people to become, you know, engineers, biologists, lawyers, so that they will be able to actually develop the projects themselves and they will not need intermediaries. So in a sense, that's, you know, the dream, and it really needs to be built from the ground up, you know. And so my concern now is not the money, because as Bessie said, you know, the money is available, but you need not only good projects, but also good people to make them happen. And the more that we can actually lead this money to the hands of people who can actually do the work, the better we will actually do. So I'm not, you know, really concerned about, you know, the amounts that are being discussed. I'm more concerned about what's going on in the ground itself, you know, looking at every single project as a lawyer would do. Like my background is an M&A lawyer, so I look at these projects with a due diligence perspective. I want to see the details and see if in the details things are actually happening the way they were supposed to do. And I think that's how, you know, many of us here who are lawyers can actually contribute a lot to do that. But you actually need to transfer this knowledge to other people who are actually in the areas that actually can make a change very substantially and very quickly.
But I think you touched on some very interesting points, Carlos. I think quite a few colleagues have been discussing sort of the tensions between achieving local results, but then when you try to scale up, it's quite often hard if you don't have the right folks at the local level to think about outcomes, to think about impacts. I can see, especially in the bank space, they're trying to move towards a language of impact rather than a language of disbursement, which might help with some of that. But it comes down to measurement. It comes down to good legal minds, good legal capabilities as well, which we need to develop. With that, I think we have a good point to come back to Monse. I think you discussed some of the very practical limitations that especially low and middle income countries have, and you've think already did a great job at showing what that happened, what that causes at the international level. But how about on the in-between COPs, right? So how that lack of capabilities for implementation plays out in your experience in between those international events when you're actually trying to get results on the ground?
Thank you, Pedro. I don't want to be the nihilist of the panel, but so yeah, from the implementation perspective, I think that my view is a bit more positive. Of course, there are constraints that reflect at the national level as well. So the same capacity constraints that I was talking about before, in the sense of course, the same countries that have very small delegations tend to have small teams at the national level, drafting national policy, lacking sometimes the necessary expertise, or civil service tends to rotate a lot. So there's of course capacity element there, which is addressed by international support, international cooperation, even multilateral banks, of course, but also by institutions like ourselves, like Legal Response International. However, sometimes I question if this externalization of domestic implementation is adequate, or is, good for the country and for then the actual implementation in the ground. Because if you externalize the development of your NDC, for example, your National Endemic Contribution or your Climate Act, then how much are you going to struggle to then implement that on the ground? And that happens a lot. There's, by looking at NDCs and comparing NDCs, you can immediately see which consultancy firm has drafted it, because they all look very similar, and the realities of countries are not as similar as their NDCs. So that's a bit of like question mark on the externalization of implementation. But still, is something that is there. Collaboration is there. Opportunities are there. Another point that I wanted to make, maybe more from a middle income perspective, and maybe here I'm putting my Chilean hat on, is that for implementation, I feel that the money doesn't flow to reward ambition. Not just that I feel it, but something that comes out quite prominently in the negotiations. If we remember the convention and the provision of finance in the convention, it said that developing countries will implement the convention to the extent that they get money or finance from developed countries to do it. Is conditional, right? And many times, because the finance has been prioritizing, of course, the most vulnerable countries in the form of grants, what happens to middle-income countries is that either it comes on the form of debt only with high interest rates, or that it's not accessible for them. So in the finance negotiations, for example, now, the group of Latin American countries where Chile sits, ILAC, they were trying to include in the goal an element that could reflect this ambition. In the last COP, we already heard the Colombian minister being very vocal about the response that the international markets had when they announced the ban on fossil fuels. Colombia has oil, and it's a large part of their economy, and they said, we're going to close it to ban it. And the reaction was a crash on the Colombian peso. So what incentives are we given in the climate finance for the domestic implementation of ambition, not just for the losses, not just for, carbon markets, but also for ambition, climate action?
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the panelists for the collaboration on moving the second round more speedily without sacrificing on the quality of the interventions. Lucia, I think, again, you're in a pretty interesting position because aside from your insurance work, you're also involved in dispute resolution and especially climate-related sort of disputes. I think it's fair to say we're seeing, again, next year the prospect of a more fragmented landscape with, again, the US. We saw some deregulatory signs on some speeches from the European Commission. We saw some things coming from the UK government as well. So we might have more uncertainty. So we can end up with, what's your sense about the role of litigation from next year onwards?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. The climate litigation is one of my favorite topics. I could talk about it for hours. I'm not going to. We'll talk about it for 6 minutes. But just as a disclaimer, I do still come from the insurance perspective in terms of what risk, especially to insurers, also to others, climate litigation poses. And it is a very fragmented landscape, as you say. There's about 2,666 cases last time I checked on the Colombia's Sabin Center database. That database and Colombia's updates, along with Grantham's and the Grantham Institute's snapshots on climate litigation. They do that yearly. I strongly recommend those for anyone with an interest in this space. And it's really, to simplify, I find that we could kind of divide up the cases in 2 main buckets. The first one being what has been termed administrative cases brought against states and public bodies by a number of by either individuals or a lot of NGOs a lot of the times. And those are cases about that really challenge ambitions of states. We've seen the kind of prime example is the Organised litigation against the Netherlands, which challenged the Dutch state ambition in setting its climate targets. And that's a role where lawyers can obviously really come in to support that in terms of holding states to account, going back to what Monta was saying. And the other bucket being cases that are more oriented against private sector and companies, especially large polluters. And we've seen a lot of litigation of this type going on in the US. And again, that's an area where obviously it's where lawyers can get involved kind of par excellence. And as Carlos was, saying, mentioning about the role that lawyers have to play here, obviously litigation is a prime one. And in terms of kind of what we can sort of predict going ahead, well, there's a lot of cases that are going on now or have been recently decided that I think will really shape the landscape going forward. And so just this week, you'll probably be aware that there's the International Court of Justice proceedings where submissions are being heard from over 110, I think, different parties by the court. And the court is that it's going to hopefully provide an advisory opinion that will bring some clarity on what states are really expected to do in terms of climate change. And that sort of clear statement from the court will hopefully shape the litigation landscape going forward. In the other kind of damages litigation bucket, which, as we might call it, a recent case that Amelia Defensi and Shell made the headlines for having been particularly favorable to the oil company, but because the Dutch court in that case found that Shell didn't have an obligation to reduce its emissions by a certain percentage. And even then, that was a clear indication that actually it wasn't so much the idea, or it can be seen as not having been so much the fact that there wasn't an obligation per se. It was just that there wasn't a specific target or amount by which a reduction was required that was set anywhere in law. And you know, some could say that might be a kind of a call for to legislators to do something about it, and in any event, a call for some clarity in the space. Moving across the Atlantic and sort of obviously with the big specter of a new regime in the US coming up soon. So there's again a lot of damages cases are still going through the courts, and there have been cases like one brought by the city of Baltimore against the number of fossil fuel defendants, where the judge found in favor of the oil plaintiffs, saying that agreeing with their arguments that yes, the city had brought the case, but the case wasn't really about damage to the city as much as an attempt to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which is not a purview of the city or of a local government, but a federal issue. And this has been the main debate that has been going on in cases in the US between the claimants that say, claimant states and municipalities saying that polluters have taken actions that have actually damaged or are going to damage the states on their territory, and energy companies arguing instead that these are kind of backhanded attempts by local governments, especially in democratic precincts, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and have a go at the industry. So there's also a request outstanding from Hawaii to the U.S. Solicitor General about this. And hopefully we'll get a clearer picture of what will be coming up. Also very interesting insurance coverage litigation dealing with the idea of what an occurrence is and specifying that greenhouse gases are pollutants. So that's now in a court decision from Hawaii. But I won't go into that further. Just to finish with a couple of thoughts.
Very quick.
Very quickly. So incoming President Trump did make history his second term when he appointed 226 federal judges out of around 860. So that is a consideration to have. And he also appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. So and obviously there's also a case brought by 19 Republican states against 5 Democratic ones on these issues. So we can see fraction playing out. At the same time, you know, he's surrounded himself with individuals like Elon Musk, very powerful, has made a point about it being a climate champion, runs an electric car company, and has also in the previous term threatened to withdraw support if Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. At Baku, Darren Woods, chairman of ExxonMobil, urged the US to stay within the agreement. Obviously, they also see the benefit of participating, which has been obviously massively criticized as well. But so whether he will go through or not with his threats remains to be seen.
2025 will be an interesting year, if nothing else, a bit too interesting probably. Without further ado, hopefully again the gods of technology will work in our favor. But I would like to welcome virtually Dr. Carolina Grotera, who's a program director at the Brazilian Ministry of Finance. Carolina wasn't here for the start, but hopefully we already introduced you a bit, and it became great to have a bit of your views, especially considering that with the Baku to billing roadmap, quite a bit was left for the Brazilian presidency to try to solve. So if you could give us a perspective view of the challenges of COP30, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to join us.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, good. So thank you, gods of technology. So far, so good. I would like to thank you, Pedro, for inviting me to join this panel, even though we have one ocean splitting us, and to say that I'm very, very glad to be here, and also apologize for not joining the beginning of the panel, but I was stuck in a meeting. And I will very briefly comment on the Ministry of Finance perspective on COP29 and the road to Belém to COP30, both from my Ministry of Finance hat, but also a little bit from my personal views, because I was in Baku, so I could see and hear a few, how can I say, episodes that were quite surprising for me. So in the COP in Baku, of course, for us at the Ministry of Finance, the most relevant outcome would be the new collective quantified goals, so the so-called NECQG. And I believe that most people were a little bit disappointed with the outcome of the NCQG. It showed us that we have an alarming climate finance gap, and the outcomes were quite below our expectations. I'm not sure how familiar you are with NCQG and what are the claims. So the claim of developing countries and least developed countries was to have at least $1.3 trillion a year in a resources pipeline for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And this and the deal that was reached in the last day of conference was of only 300 billion a year. And also the countries in the global north that would be the most responsible for providing those resources, they tried and to bring other actors in the table, not only mid-income countries such as China, for example, or the big BRICS countries, but also MDBs. And Brazil has aligned and negotiated in the form of a bloc with the G27 and China to try and refrain this and to claim for the fair level of resources. And what is left for us from Baku to Belém is one, to try and seek to boost and enhance this volume of resources so that we can finally reach $1.3 trillion for climate action a year globally. What can I say? Of course, that these resources, I mean, the 300 billions that are already negotiated would come in the form of public resources, donation, or very cheap concessional resources. This is very important for countries in the global south, because especially for example, this is definitely the case of Brazil. We have to create more fiscal space, so the least we have to spend in climate action with mitigation and preparation and resilience, and also investments in mitigation, the more space we have to meet other objectives and priorities of the Brazilian government. So it's very important for us that these resources come as cheap and as the lowest credit possible, and that unfortunately did not materialize. But moving to the bright side of things, I would like to also say that we are very confident on the potential of the Brazilian government to lead the next COP, the COP30. This will be, I would like to highlight two points. First of all, this will be the first COP that it's in the Amazon, so it's going to be in Belém, one of our most important cities in the Brazilian Amazon. And for the first time in 3 years, the COP is going to be hosted by a country that is not almost entirely dependent on fossil fuels. So I believe that we will be able to shed some light on many other aspects that have been overlooked in recent years during COPs. And what I would like to say as well is that much of the Brazilian outcomes for COP30 are already building upon all the work that the country has done during the G20 presidency. So, for example, we had the Task Force for Climate, which claimed and convened countries to enhance their NDCs and to deliver NDCs with higher ambition. Countries have the deadline to announce their new NDCs up to February 2055. Also, the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which was led by the Brazilian Ministry of Finance, claimed and prepared a roadmap for improving the access of developing countries and least developed countries for concessional resources, for example, for MDBs, such as the World Bank, the IDB, or even climate funds and environmental funds, because sometimes, often the resources are there, but countries don't always have the capabilities to access those resources in terms of either because they cannot provide the necessary guarantees, which are often quite high, or because they don't have the institutional capabilities to access those resources because of bureaucracies and the type of documentation that is required, and so on and so forth. And also during the G20, we claimed for the reform of the international financial architecture, which also comes in line with improving access to climate finance globally. And as I said, the global climate finances, we are lagging behind, and we need to create fiscal space. And so that's, I will speak a little bit of the Brazilian experience. We are being very, very innovative and creative on redesigning the financial instruments that we have here to mobilize resources for climate finance. So here in the Ministry of Finance, we coordinate the ecological transformation plan. Of the pillars of the ecological transformation plan is the sustainable finance pillar. And the other pillars are like technology and innovation, bioeconomy and agri-food systems, energy transition, circular economy, and infrastructure and adaptation. And in the sustainable finance pillar, we have been designing and developing or repurposing instruments in order to enable the actions of the other pillars in order to reach goals such as tripling the capacity of renewable energy up to 2030, for example, as preconized by the IEA, just to give one example. So we just passed our bill for our carbon markets. We've been developing our sustainable taxation, sustainable taxonomy, which will define which activities can be considered sustainable or not, and this will discipline agents in capital markets, in the financial sectors, and avoid greenwashing in portfolios, and so on and so forth. We have launched a program to mobilize foreign capital through currency hedge, for example. So we have we prepared a basket of instruments that are that clearly have the aim to mobilize resources for climate finance and to implement the ecological transformation in Brazil. And just to wrap up, we also have other challenges in addition to the financial one that we will try and address during COP30. So for example, in COP29, there were two negotiation processes that are still pending, which no deal has been reached, and Article 16 has been claimed, which is the global goal on adaptation. So we'll have the task of proposing metrics and indicators of adaptation that can be interoperable and comparable across countries, and also to leverage resources for adaptation, and also the Just Transition Program, which is, how can I say, definitely something that Brazil would be willing, because this is very, very in line with our current politics to ensure a just transition, whether it refers to jobs, to regional inequalities, to gender and race inequalities, and to vulnerability to climate change. And last but not least, hopefully we can revive and try to operationalize the concept of transitioning away from fossil fuels. As I said, this is the first time in 3 years in which negotiations are being held in a country that's not entirely dependent on almost entirely dependent on oil. And that would be a major advance, I believe, for the international climate community. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for providing us with, I think, a big picture overview of some of there are interesting innovations, I think, happening in the Global South, and especially as we have less happening in some countries in the Global North, those will become potentially important benchmarks more and more. And it sure sounds like you have a pretty busy year ahead of you, but it's good to know that the ambition is there. With that, we're already over time, so I'll again be a bit authoritarian, but thank you all for coming. Hopefully you had, you heard some interesting discussions. I'll thank again all my panelists. If you can join me in thanking them.